You know, sometimes life throws you a curveball so hard, it shatters everything you thought you knew. But can you imagine the gut-wrenching shock, the pure, raw disbelief, when that curveball comes from your own sister? Right there at her birthday party in front of everyone, she looked me dead in the eye and wished for my death. I was holding the cake knife, and in that moment, it felt like an extension of my own rage. It was my 23-year-old sister, Vanessa's, birthday. And as she blew out those candles, she announced, "I wish my brother would die so I can finally be an only child." Then, with a sickeningly sweet smile, she turned to our parents and all 45 guests as if she just delivered the cleverest punchline of the century. My parents, mind you, had rented out half a country club for this woman. This same woman who still lived in her childhood bedroom had never held a job for more than 3 weeks, and was, at that very moment, wishing me out of existence. Vanessa just laughed. She looked straight at me, her eyes glinting. Every birthday for the last 10 years, I've wished the same thing, to be an only child. This year, I just figured I'd finally be specific about how. That's when the world seemed to tilt. My mother's champagne glass slipped, exploding on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. "Vanessa, what is wrong with you?" But she just shrugged, completely unfazed, and reached for a gift, tearing into the wrapping like she hadn't just prayed for her own brother's demise. "Oh, come on, Mom. You know life would be easier with just me. No competition, no splitting the inheritance, no perfect son standing next to me, making me look like a failure." Our cousin Brooke gasped from 2 tables over. "You're actually admitting you want your brother dead?" Vanessa barely looked up from her new designer handbag. "Want is a strong word. There's a difference." She held the bag up, flaunting it to the room. 22,800. Imagine if they didn't have to buy his gifts, too. I could have gotten the Birkin. And just like that, the mask slipped a little further. I'd been buying my own birthday presents for the last 5 years because our parents kept forgetting mine. But never, not once, forgot hers. "Vanessa," I said, my voice dangerously low, "they forgot my birthday completely last year." She just smiled, a cold, empty smile. "Yeah, that was a good year. One step closer to them forgetting you exist at all." My great-aunt Rosalind, usually so poised, shot up from her chair, rattling the table. "This is disgusting. How can you talk about your brother like this?" Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Because it's the truth, Aunt Roz. Everybody in this family thinks it. I'm just the only one brave enough to say it out loud." She pointed a manicured finger at me. "He makes everything about his achievements, his promotion, his engagement, his new house. All things, I might add, I worked my butt off for, while she slept until noon and spent my parents' money like it printed itself." "You live in Mom and Dad's house, Vanessa," I retorted, the words a raw accusation. She jumped up furious. "Because he took all the good opportunities. He got the scholarships, he got the internships. He got everything because he was born first." She was actually blaming me for being older. If I'd been born first, I'd be the successful one. Our dad, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice strained. "Vanessa, you dropped out of college 3 separate times." She spun on him, her voice shrill, "because every professor compared me to him. Do you have any idea what it's like being the stupid sibling?" She had never studied a day in her life, just expected to pass because our parents wrote donation checks. "I'm not stupid," she shrieked. "I'm overshadowed." My fiancée, Elena, stood up beside me, her hand finding mine. Her voice was calm but firm. "You're not overshadowed. You're lazy, and you're entitled." Vanessa let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "Of course you'd defend him. You probably wish I was dead too, so you don't have to see me at family dinners." Elena didn't deny it, and that somehow made Vanessa even angrier. "See? Everyone here would be happier if I was an only child." Then Grandma, who hadn't uttered a single word all afternoon, slammed her cane down on the floor. Twack. "Vanessa Claire-Quile, you are a disgrace." She started walking towards Vanessa, slow and steady, her eyes like flint. "Your brother paid for your rehab. Twice." The entire room went silent. Vanessa's gambling problem was not supposed to be public information. "Grandma, that's private." But Grandma kept walking. "He paid for your DUI lawyer. He paid off your credit cards. He's been paying your car insurance for 2 years." She turned, her gaze burning into my parents. Did either of you know that your precious daughter owes her brother $52,000? Mom went white. 52,000? Mom went white. 52,000? Vanessa told us she was paying her own way. Grandma let out a short, humorless laugh. Paying her own way? She hasn't held a job in 2 years. Her brother has been her bank. From her purse, she pulled out a folded stack of papers. I have the receipts, because somebody had to co-sign the loans he took out to cover her messes. Vanessa lunged for the papers, but Grandma was faster, cracking her across the knuckles with the cane. Don't you dare. These prove exactly what kind of parasite you are. Our family friend Victor, a lawyer for 30 years, reached over and took the papers. He read through them, right there at the table, his brow furrowed. These are legitimate loans, all in his name, all for Vanessa's expenses. He looked up at me. Son, you've been financing her entire life. I finally found my voice, a strangled whisper. She's my sister. I thought I was helping her. Vanessa actually laughed in my face. Helping? You were showing off. Look at the perfect big brother riding in to save the day again. She kicked her chair sideways. I never asked for your help. That was a lie. A blatant, infuriating lie. She had called me sobbing every single time, begging. You called me at 3 a.m, threatening to hurt yourself if I didn't pay your bookie. Everyone gasped. Vanessa's face went dark red. That was private. You had no right to say that in front of people. Elena, my amazing Elena, pulled out her phone. I have the voicemails, Vanessa. 31 voicemails of you threatening to kill yourself if he didn't send money. She pressed play. Vanessa's slurred, desperate voice filled the stunned silence, begging for $6,000 or she'd drive off the overpass. The room went dead quiet. I watched my sister's face morph from smug to shocked to furious in about 3 seconds flat. My mom started crying, those big, ugly sobs again, while Dad just stared at Vanessa like she was a stranger. Grandma stood there, cane half raised, ready to swing again if Vanessa tried anything. 45 guests sat frozen in their chairs. Somewhere, in the distance, I could hear silverware clinking from another event down the hall, a surreal counterpoint to our shattered reality. Vanessa's hands were shaking. Her face went from red to almost purple. She stared at Elena's phone like she wanted to smash it. Then she jumped up, lunged across the table, grabbing for it. Victor, bless his heart, moved faster than I thought a man in his 60s could. He got between them, put a hand flat on Vanessa's shoulder, and pushed her back into her seat. She stumbled, nearly going face first, into her own birthday cake. His voice was calm, but it had iron in it. Sit down, right now. Vanessa looked around the room, at all the faces staring back. Some people had their phones out, recording everything. Cousin Brooke had a hand clamped over her mouth. The table beside us had stopped eating mid-bite to watch the spectacle. It hit me then. There was no taking this back. Everyone knew everything now. Aunt Rosalind stood up, her chair screeching against the marble floor. She grabbed her purse and announced to the whole room that she would not stay one more minute at a party for someone who wished death on her own family. She walked toward the exit, never looking back. Her husband followed. Then Uncle Glenn and his wife. Then more. Within 5 minutes, half the guests were gone. Mom ran to the door, trying to stop people, begging them to stay, saying Vanessa didn't mean it. She was just emotional. Please don't go. Grandma walked over and grabbed Mom's arm. She told her to stop making excuses. She said Vanessa meant every word, and every person in that room knew it. Mom's face crumpled and she cried harder. Dad, finally moving for the first time since the voicemail played, looked at Vanessa and asked if what Grandma said about the $52,000 was true. His voice came out strange and quiet. Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She just stared at the floor. Dad waited, maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned and looked at me. Tears were running down his face. I had never once in my life seen my father cry. He asked me why I never told them. I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. I explained that Vanessa threatened to hurt herself every single time I even thought about it. I told him she'd call me in the middle of the night, swearing she'd be dead by morning if Mom and Dad ever found out about the money. Dad's face drained of color, and he sat down hard in his chair. A man in a dark suit appeared beside our table. It was the country club manager. He spoke very quietly, suggesting we move this somewhere private as other guests were complaining about the noise. He gestured toward a hallway. Mom nodded and gathered her purse. We all stood and followed him down a long corridor lined with oil paintings. He opened the door to a small conference room with a long table and leather chairs, and we filed in. The door clicked shut behind us. Through the window, I could see what was left of the party. People picking at cake, whispering. It was just immediate family in the room now, plus Elena, Grandma, and Victor. Victor spread Grandma's papers across the conference table, put on his reading glasses, and went through every page like he was preparing for trial. He confirmed I was legally on the hook for loans totaling $49,000. He tapped line after line where Vanessa's expenses were listed as the reason for each one. Then he explained that Vanessa had zero legal obligation to pay me back unless we drew up a formal repayment agreement, signed and witnessed. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. She looked at Vanessa and asked if she seriously expected her brother to just eat all of that money. Vanessa didn't answer. Victor kept going through the stack, rehab invoices, lawyer fees, credit card statements, every single one in my name. Vanessa exploded out of her chair. She screamed that we were all ganging up on her at her own birthday party. She said I was trying to destroy her life by airing her private struggles in front of everyone. She jabbed a finger at me and called me vindictive. Elena took out her phone again and scrolled. She hit play on another voicemail, and Vanessa's voice filled the room calling me an idiot for not sending money fast enough, slurring her words, threatening to show up at my office and make a scene in front of my whole team. Dad shot up out of his chair and told Vanessa to shut her mouth right now. Vanessa looked stunned, like Dad had never spoken to her that way in her entire life, because he hadn't. Something broke loose in my chest, and suddenly I was talking, and I couldn't stop. I told them about every 3 phone call, every threat. Every time Vanessa swore she'd end it all if I didn't pay her bookie or cover her bar tab or bail her out of whatever hole she dug that week. I told them about the night she called me from a casino parking garage, saying she'd drive her car into the concrete pillar if I didn't wire her $2,500 within the hour. I told them about finding her passed out on my front porch at 4 in the morning, covered in her own vomit. Mom kept whispering, I had no idea, over and over like a prayer. Grandma cut her off cold. She said willful blindness was still a choice. She said Mom and Dad chose not to see it because not seeing it was easier than dealing with it. Dad turned to Vanessa and asked her flat out how she planned to fund her lifestyle with no job and no income. Vanessa mumbled something nobody could hear. Dad told her to say it louder. She said she figured she'd have her inheritance someday. The sheer entitlement in that sentence hung in the air like smoke, choking us all. Dad stared at her for a long, long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the door, yanked it open, and disappeared into the hallway. We heard a loud bang, then another. Dad was punching the wall. Mom started to get up, but Grandma told her to sit down and let the man process. Elena, ever the calm voice of reason, suggested everyone take a breath and meet again tomorrow. When nobody was running on pure adrenaline, she said we all needed time to cool down and think. Vanessa shook her head and said she refused to ever meet again. She said this was all my fault and she was done with this family. Stood up and headed for the door. Grandma moved faster than I'd seen her move in 15 years. She got to the door before Vanessa and barred it with her cane held sideways like a gate. She looked up at my sister and told her that if she walked out that door right now, she was choosing to lose her entire family in one afternoon. She said this was her one chance to face what she'd done and try to fix it. Vanessa stood there with her hand frozen on the door handle, her eyes darting between Grandma and the rest of us. Her hand stayed on that handle for what felt like an hour. Then her shoulders started to shake and tears came down her face. And for the first time in my entire life, my sister looked genuinely broken instead of just performing broken to get something. She turned around and walked back to the table, her head down. She dropped into the chair and buried her face in her hands. Her voice came out so small, I almost missed it. She said she didn't know how to fix this. Mom shot out of her seat and rushed toward her with her arms open. Grandma's cane came down on the table with a bang that made everybody jump. She pointed at Mom and told her to sit back down right now. Mom froze halfway there, her mouth open like she wanted to argue, but something in Grandma's face made her back up and sink into her chair. Vanessa kept her face in her hands, and her whole body shook with crying that, for once, sounded real. Victor cleared his throat and laid the papers out in two neat piles. He said there were two separate problems in this room that were connected but had to be handled differently. The money was one problem. Vanessa's gambling was the other. He looked around at all of us and said if there was any hope of this family surviving, both had to be dealt with seriously. He said Vanessa needed real treatment this time, not the outpatient programs I'd already paid for twice. The ones where she could just skip sessions and nobody checked. He pulled out his phone, scrolled, and said he knew an inpatient facility 2 hours away that specialized in gambling addiction. A 60-day program, locked schedule. Vanessa's head came up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said she couldn't possibly be gone for 60 days. Grandma laughed, and it was not a kind laugh. Gone from what exactly? Since you're about to be homeless anyway. Dad walked back into the room right then, and everyone turned. His knuckles were scraped raw and bleeding, and through the open door, you could see 2 dents in the hallway drywall. He walked straight to Vanessa and stood over her. His voice came out flat and cold when he said she had 1 week to find a job or she was out of the house for good. Vanessa actually laughed, but it came out bitter and ugly. She said nobody on earth would hire her with her record and her DUI, and the fact that she'd been fired from every job she'd ever touched. Dad leaned down close to her face and said, "Maybe you should have thought about that before the DUI he paid a small fortune to make disappear." Her laugh died in her throat. She stared at the table. Something inside me finally snapped loose and I stood up. My voice shook when I said I was done. Done paying for anything. Done co-signing. Done answering the phone at 3 in the morning. I said Vanessa needed to feel a real consequence for once in her life instead of having me throw my body between her and every single one. Mom turned to me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "She's your sister and family helps family." Elena stood up beside me, her hand finding mine. She said I had been helping for 2 straight years while they forgot I existed. She said I'd taken out loans that would take me a decade to clear while Vanessa slept until noon and gambled away money that was never hers. Mom started to say something, but Elena kept going. She said they spent $4,000 on a country club party for Vanessa while they forgot my birthday completely last year. Not a call, not a text. Mom's face fell apart, and she covered her mouth with both hands. Grandma stood, and the whole room went quiet. She planted her cane on the floor like a flag and looked at Vanessa. She said she was removing Vanessa from her will, effective Monday, and she would stay removed until she completed real treatment and paid back at least half of what she owed me. Vanessa's head snapped up, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She had been counting on that inheritance. She had built her entire imaginary future on money she had never earned. Mom grabbed Grandma's arm and begged her to reconsider. She said Vanessa needed that security. Grandma pulled her arm free and said what Vanessa needed was to learn that actions have consequences. She said she had watched this family enable her for 23 years and she was done being polite about it. Victor suggested we all take a few days to cool off and then meet again properly. He said it should happen at Grandma's house, with a family therapist in the room, so it didn't turn into another bonfire. He said he'd draft a formal repayment agreement for Vanessa to sign, something legally binding with a payment schedule and interest. Vanessa looked up and asked what happened if she refused to sign it. Victor held her eyes and said, "Then your brother sues you." He said the debt was real, documented, and provable, and a judgment would follow her for the rest of her life. Vanessa slumped back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. We agreed to meet at Grandma's house in 3 days, 2 chav sharp. Victor said he'd find a family therapist who could come on short notice. Everyone started gathering their things. Out through the window, what was left of the party had gone completely silent. The remaining guests were pretending very hard not to watch us through the glass. Elena took my hand and led me out. My legs felt unsteady, and my whole body was trembling like I'd just finished a race. We walked back through the country club, past all the people who had heard my own sister wish me dead. Some of them looked away, some of them stared. Elena kept her arm around me the whole way to the parking lot. She drove us home, and I shook so hard in the passenger seat that my teeth chattered. She reached over and held my hand on the console. She told me she was proud of me for finally standing up to all of them. I felt guilty and relieved and furious all at once, all tangled together in my chest. I couldn't stop seeing Vanessa's face in the moment the whole room turned on her. Part of me felt sorry for her, and part of me felt like she had earned every second of it, and I honestly didn't know which part was right. We got home and I fell asleep, still wearing my suit from the party. The next morning, I woke up to my phone vibrating itself off the nightstand. 78 text messages from different relatives. Some said I did the right thing. Some said I was cruel. I scrolled through them, my stomach turning over. Mom's message was near the bottom. It said I had humiliated Vanessa in public and ruined her birthday. It said I was vindictive and selfish and I should be ashamed of myself. I turned the phone off and dropped it on the bed. Elena came in with a plate of eggs and toast, set it on my lap, and sat down next to me. She said Vanessa humiliated herself the moment she wished her brother dead in front of 45 people. She said all I did was finally tell the truth about what had been done to me. I pushed the eggs around the plate, but couldn't really eat. The wham mine rang around 10,000, and I almost let it go. Elena picked it up and mouthed that it was Grandma. I took the phone, and Grandma told me Vanessa had shown up at her door at 2 in the morning, drunk, begging for money. She said Vanessa pounded on the door and screamed until the neighbor's lights came on and she had to call the police to have her removed from the property. Her voice stayed perfectly steady when she said Vanessa needed to hit bottom before she'd ever reach for help. She said she had lived through the exact same thing with my grandfather's drinking decades ago. She said, "Sometimes loving someone means letting them fall all the way down." I thanked her and hung up. My phone buzzed again even though I'd shut it off, and I realized Elena had turned it back on. There was a new message from Aunt Rosalind. She said she wanted to apologize for not seeing it sooner. She said she'd always assumed Vanessa was just immature, but now she understood she'd been watching deliberate manipulation for years. She offered to help pay for family therapy. She said she felt sick about all the time she'd laughed along at Vanessa's little jokes at my expense across the dinner table. I read it 3 times and something in my chest loosened just slightly. I spent the next 2 days trying to bury myself in work and checking my email every 10 minutes. Victor sent the draft agreement Thursday morning. I opened the attachment, my hands actually shaking. 12 pages of formal legal language that made the whole thing suddenly terribly real. Vanessa Coyle would pay $550 a month for 96 months at 4% annual interest, bringing the total to just over $60,000. I stared at the numbers until they smeared together on the screen. Elena came up behind my chair and read over my shoulder. She put her hands on my shoulders and squeezed. She said, "You'll probably never see most of that money, but having it on paper meant Vanessa could never again pretend the debt didn't exist." I printed the agreement and slid it into a folder and tried very hard not to calculate how many years of my savings I had already burned trying to rescue someone who resented me for the rescue. The house felt too quiet that afternoon, so I went for a walk around the block and counted sidewalk cracks instead of dollars. 3 blocks from home, my phone rang, and Dad's name came up on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I genuinely could not remember the last time my father had called me himself instead of having Mom do it. His voice sounded sanded down when he asked if I'd meet him for coffee tomorrow morning before the family meeting. Just the 2 of us. I said yes before I could invent a reason to say no. He named a place near my office and said he'd be there at 8. I walked home slowly, wondering what he needed to say that couldn't be said in front of anyone else. Dad was already at a corner table when I walked into the coffee shop. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it, if he'd slept at all. He stood up when he saw me and pulled out my chair, which he had never once done in my entire life. I sat down and ordered a black coffee. He ordered the same, and we sat in silence until the server walked away. He folded his hands on the table and stared at them for a long time. Then he said he had been a terrible father to me, while spoiling Vanessa into someone useless and entitled. His voice cracked on the word terrible, and I realized my father was crying in a coffee shop at 80 Lynn in the morning. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited. He wiped his eyes with a napkin and told me something I had never heard in 26 years. Mom had a miscarriage between me and Vanessa. They got pregnant when I was 2 and lost the baby at 5 months, and Mom came apart for almost a year afterward. He said when Vanessa was born 3 years later, they were so terrified of losing another child that they wrapped her in cotton and never took it off. He said he knew it wasn't an excuse. He just wanted me to understand how the scale tipped and never tipped back. The server brought our coffee, and we both pretended we weren't two grown men crying in public. Dad said they treated Vanessa like she was made of glass. And they treated me like I was made of steel, like I could absorb anything, including being ignored. He apologized for the forgotten birthdays, for missing my college graduation, for never once driving out to see the house I bought. Then he broke down completely, face in his hands, shoulders shaking. I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm because I didn't know what else to do with myself. He looked up with red eyes and said he was sorry for making me invisible in my own family for 26 years. I pulled my hand back and wrapped it around my cup. I told him the explanation helped me understand them, but understanding didn't erase growing up feeling like furniture. He nodded and said he knew that, and he wasn't asking for instant forgiveness. He said he wanted to rebuild something with me if I was willing to let him try. He told me he'd already started seeing a therapist about his enabling. 3 sessions in, he said he was only beginning to grasp how much damage he'd done by always choosing Vanessa's comfort over everyone else's sanity. I asked what finally flipped the switch after 23 years. He said it was the voicemails. Hearing his daughter threaten to kill herself as a negotiating tactic to drain money out of her own brother made him realize the child he'd protected had grown into something he didn't recognize, and that he had built her with his own 2 hands by never once saying no. He said watching me quietly pay for everything while they threw her a $4,000 party made him physically sick with shame. We sat there another hour while he asked me questions about my life that were a decade overdue. My job, my engagement, what Elena and I do on weekends. It felt strange having his full attention for the first time. Strange and nice in a way that ached. When we left, he hugged me hard and said he'd do better starting today. The family meeting at Grandma's house was set for 2 Saturday afternoon. Elena and I arrived at 2 Point Sarstein and found Mom, Dad, and Grandma already seated in the living room. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and steady, kind eyes stood up and introduced herself as Marisol Vega, the family therapist Victor had found. She shook my hand, shook Elena's, and told us to sit anywhere we felt comfortable. The living room had 2 couches and 3 chairs pulled into a loose circle. I took the chair by the window. Elena sat beside me and held my hand. Marisol walked us through the ground rules. No interrupting, no name-calling. Nobody walks out without saying so. Everyone gets their turn. And she would referee. We all nodded and then we sat in thick, awkward silence waiting for Vanessa. 2:15 came and went. Mom kept checking her phone and texting. At 2:30, the doorbell finally rang and Grandma went to answer it. Vanessa walked in looking like she hadn't showered since the party. Hair flattened on one side, mascara ghosts under her eyes, clothes wrinkled. She took the chair farthest from me and didn't look at anyone. Mom immediately got up and tried to perch on the arm of Vanessa's chair, and Marisol gently asked her to return to her own seat. Mom looked wounded, but she went back to the couch next to Dad. Marisol opened by thanking everyone for showing up and acknowledging how hard this was. She said, "Today's goal was simple. Understand what happened. Begin building a way forward." Then she looked at Vanessa and asked her to explain, in her own words, why she wished for her brother's death at her birthday party. Vanessa stared at the carpet and said nothing. Marisol waited. The silence stretched until it hurt. Mom opened her mouth and Marisol raised one hand without looking at her. After what felt like 10 full minutes, Vanessa finally spoke so quietly we all leaned in. She said she resented me for being successful while she felt like a complete failure. She said watching me accomplish things made her feel worthless and small. She said she wanted me gone so the comparison would finally stop. Her voice got louder as she went, and she looked up at me with tears cutting down her face. She said every time anyone mentioned my promotion or my engagement or my house, it felt like they were reading out a list of everything she'd ruined about her own life. She said she knew it was wrong to wish me dead, but in that moment, she just wanted the measuring stick to disappear. I waited until Marisol nodded at me. Then I pointed out that nobody in this family ever compared us, nobody except her. I said I never talked about my wins around family precisely because I knew it set her off. I'd spent years shrinking every piece of good news down to a footnote. Vanessa stared at me and then admitted that was true. She said it didn't matter whether I talked about my life or not because my existing at all felt like a verdict on hers. Marisol wrote something in her notebook and said there was a word for that, projection. She explained that Vanessa was running the comparison inside her own head and then billing me for it. Vanessa nodded slowly and said she'd never once thought about it that way. Marisol asked her what she honestly thought would happen if I wasn't in her life anymore. Vanessa went quiet for a minute, then she said she'd probably just find somebody else to resent for being better than her. The honesty of it startled everyone in the room, including her. Mom had been silent the entire session, but now she started to cry. She said she had enabled Vanessa for years, making excuses, treating a grown woman like a fragile child. Then she looked at me and apologized for ignoring my accomplishments and forgetting my birthdays. She said she never learned how to be a mother to me because she never tried, and there was no version of sorry big enough for that. She cried harder, and Dad put his arm around her. She said she'd been so busy bodyguarding Vanessa from the world that she forgot she had a son who needed parents, too. Marisol handed her the tissue box and asked what she thought she could do differently going forward. Mom wiped her face and said she had to stop making Vanessa's chaos the center of gravity in this family and start treating both her children like they mattered equally. She said she knew it sounded simple and would be anything but. After 20 years of running the same pattern, Marisol turned to address the whole circle. She said our family had been operating a broken system where Vanessa's needs always came first and everyone else silently rearranged themselves around her. She said breaking the system meant everyone changing their role, not just Vanessa. She recommended weekly family sessions for 3 months, plus individual therapy for Vanessa and for Mom. Dad said he was already going and intended to keep going. Grandma announced she did not need therapy on account of being the only person in this family who had been seeing clearly the entire time. Marisol smiled and said, sometimes the people most certain they don't need help are the ones who need it most, but she'd never force anyone. I said I'd do whatever it took to fix this family, or at least find out whether it could be fixed. Then Vanessa asked what would happen if she decided not to do any of it. The room went completely still. Dad's voice came out hard as concrete. He said if she refused treatment, she'd be evicted from their house and cut off financially. The same week, Mom started to protest, and Dad topped straight over her. He said he was finished sponsoring his daughter's refusal to grow up. He said she had 1 week to choose, get help or get out. Mom stared at him with her mouth open like she'd never met this man before. I sat there watching my father enforce the first real boundary of my lifetime, and something shifted in my chest like a bone resetting. Vanessa signed the repayment agreement at Grandma's dining room table, with Victor standing over her like a bailiff. Her hand shook so badly the pen kept skidding, and she had to restart her signature twice. Mom watched from the doorway crying, while Dad stood at Victor's shoulder, making sure every line got initialed. $550 a month, 8 years, 4%. Vanessa stared at the total after interest. $58,000, and the last of the color left her face. Victor collected the signed pages and made copies while Marisol flipped through her notes on treatment programs. She slid a brochure across the table. An inpatient facility specializing in gambling addiction. 60 days. No phone for the first 2 weeks. Group therapy twice a day. Attendance mandatory. Vanessa pushed the brochure away and said she was not going away for 2 months. Grandma tapped her cane on the floor 3 times, slow, and reminded her about the revised will sitting in her lawyer's office. She said the will currently left Vanessa exactly nothing, and it would stay that way until she finished a real program. Vanessa picked the brochure back up. She read the rules. No electronics, no visitors for 3 weeks, full participation or discharge. Dad said he would personally drive her there Monday morning and stay for the family orientation. Marisol explained that the program director, a counselor named Theo, ran one of the best operations in the state, with a 70% success rate among patients who completed all 60 days. Vanessa asked what happened to the other 30%. Marisol said, honestly, some relapse, and that didn't mean the program failed them. She said recovery was a decision Vanessa would have to make fresh every morning for the rest of her life. Mom asked if she could visit, and Marisol said family sessions opened after week 3. The cost was covered under Dad's insurance, but Vanessa would contribute from her own paychecks once she had a job. I sat there listening to them plan my sister's treatment and felt absolutely nothing except tired. Elena squeezed my hand under the table, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. Then Marisol turned to me and asked what I needed from Vanessa before she left for the program. I looked at my sister, slumped small in her chair, smaller than I'd ever seen her. The words came out before I could screen them. I told her I needed space from her after the program ended, and that rebuilding trust would take years if it happened at all. She nodded slowly. No argument, no excuses. Then she apologized for the death wish at her party, for using me as her personal ATM for 2 years. Her voice cracked when she said she understood if I never forgave her. It sounded different from every other sorry she'd ever said while her hand was out. This one had weight to it, like she actually understood what she had done. Mom stood up and crossed the room to me. She asked if I could ever forgive her for being a mother who forgot my birthdays and slept through my whole adult life. I told her the truth, that I didn't know yet, but I was willing to try therapy together and find out. She cried harder and said she didn't deserve another chance, but she'd take whatever I was willing to give her. Dad cleared his throat and said we should end the session before the whole family dissolved on Grandma's carpet. Marisol scheduled the next meeting for 2 weeks out and reminded Vanessa to stay clean until intake day. We all left Grandma's house in silence, and I sat in Elena's car, watching my parents pull away with my sister in their back seat. The week before Vanessa entered the program was the strangest week of my life because my parents suddenly started acting like parents instead of Vanessa's personal staff. Dad took her to the library and sat with her while she filled out job applications online. They printed 15 of them. Warehouses, retail, restaurants, anywhere that didn't ask for a degree. Vanessa came home with 3 interviews scheduled, and Dad bought her 2 plain interview outfits from a discount store. Mom ironed them and ran mock interviews at the kitchen table, asking her about her greatest weakness. While the kettle boiled, I stopped by their house to drop off documents Victor needed and found Dad coaching Vanessa on a proper handshake in the hallway. She caught me watching from the doorway and gave me this half smile, embarrassed, and something else, something almost like pride. Mom asked if I'd stay for dinner, and I said Elena was waiting at home. The truth was, I couldn't stand there and watch my parents finally raise Vanessa the way they should have 20 years ago. It felt too late and too small, and also somehow like something was finally moving. Dad walked me out to my car and apologized again for the missed birthdays and the missed everything. He said seeing those loan documents with my signature on them was the moment he understood how completely they had failed me. I told him I appreciated the words, but actions were the only currency I took anymore. He nodded and said he was working on exactly that every week in therapy. I drove home and told Elena about the applications and the interviews. She said it was good they were stepping up, even if it arrived 20 years past the deadline. That night, I lay awake thinking about my sister walking into job interviews and what it would mean if someone actually said yes. Someone said yes. Vanessa got called back for a second interview at a distribution warehouse paying $16 an hour. Dad drove her there and sat in the parking lot for an hour while she met the hiring manager. They offered her the job on the spot. Training to start in 2 weeks. She called me from Dad's car to tell me, and her voice sounded different. She said she had never once gotten a job by herself without Mom calling in a favor or Dad writing a check first. I congratulated her, and I meant it, even though part of me was still furious about everything else. At the next session with Marisol, Vanessa told the room about the warehouse job. Marisol pointed out it was the first thing she had accomplished entirely on her own in years. No family money. No family phone calls. Vanessa admitted it felt different from things that got handed to her. She said filling out the application herself and surviving the interview made the job feel like hers instead of something on loan. Mom cried happy tears and hugged her, and I felt my jaw tighten because she had never once cried happy tears over any of my promotions. Marisol caught my face and asked what I was feeling. I said it was hard watching my parents celebrate Vanessa's entry-level job, harder than they had ever celebrated my entire career. Mom looked gutted and started apologizing, and Marisol stopped her. She explained that I was allowed to grieve the past even while supporting Vanessa's progress, and both things could be true in the same room. The session got heavy after that. Everyone finally sang out loud how lopsided this family had been for 2 decades. Dad said he was proud of both his children, and he was ashamed it took a catastrophe to make him say it properly. Vanessa's warehouse job started 2 days before her intake date, so she worked 3 shifts and cleared about $200. She handed me 50 of it toward the debt without anyone asking her to. The gesture knocked me sideways more than the money ever could. Elena and I had been planning our wedding through all of this chaos. The venue was booked 6 months out, but the invitations hadn't gone and the guest list wasn't final. I sat at our kitchen table with the list in front of me and stared at Vanessa's name. Elena asked what I was thinking, and I told her the truth. I didn't want Vanessa at our wedding. Not even if she finished the program. Not even if she changed. Elena said that was completely fair after everything my sister had put me through. Mom called later that week asking about wedding plans, and I told her Vanessa would not be invited. The line went quiet. Then she asked if I was sure. I said I was protecting my boundaries and my wedding day needed to belong to Elena and me, not to managing Vanessa. Mom sounded hurt, but she said she understood. At the next therapy session, she brought it up anyway. She said she was struggling with Vanessa being excluded. Marisol asked her why, and Mom admitted she wanted the family to look whole and united in the photos. Marisol pointed out that looking whole and being healthy were two very different things. Then she asked Mom one question. Whose comfort matters more in his wedding day? Mom went quiet for a long moment and then said quietly, "Mine did." Marisol helped her see that my boundary wasn't a punishment aimed at Vanessa, it was a wall protecting me. Mom nodded slowly and said she would support my decision, even though it hurt her. After the session, she hugged me and whispered that she was proud of me for knowing what I needed. That one sentence landed bigger than every apology before it combined. Vanessa entered Theo's inpatient program on a Monday morning. Dad drove, Mom rode shotgun, and I stayed home because I needed distance from the whole production. Elena and I sat on our couch that evening, and I felt this physical wave of relief move through me. For 2 whole months, my phone could not ring with an emergency. For 2 whole months, nobody could threaten me into a wire transfer. We decided to take a weekend trip to the coast to celebrate the silence. Elena booked a little bed and breakfast over the water, and we left Friday straight from work. Driving out of the city felt like taking off a coat made of lead. We walked the beach. We ate at tiny restaurants. We did not say the words Vanessa, parents, or therapy for 2 entire days. Saturday night, we sat on the balcony watching the sun go down, and Elena asked how I was really doing. I told her I'd spent so much of myself managing my sister's disasters that I had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to just live my own life. She said she'd watched me stay braced for 2 years, shoulders up around my ears, always waiting for the next crisis call. She was right. For 2 years, I had lived in emergency mode, sleeping with the ringer on, ready to drop everything. The weekend away showed me exactly how heavy that had been, because of how light I felt without it. We stayed an extra night and drove home Monday, more relaxed than we'd been in months. For the first time in years, I caught myself thinking about what I wanted next instead of bracing for what Vanessa would break next. 3 weeks into the program, my phone rang from an unknown number, and I almost let it die. It was Theo calling with a progress update. He said Vanessa fought the program hard the first week. Then something cracked open during a group session. She started engaging honestly instead of performing compliance. He said she had admitted out loud and in detail to manipulating her family and was doing real work on where the pattern came from. He said her remorse in the family processing exercises looked genuine and that she had real potential for recovery if she stayed committed after discharge. I asked him the only question I cared about. Was she just performing for the counselors the way she had performed for everyone her whole life? Theo said that risk always exists in addiction treatment, but he said performers do the minimum, and Vanessa had started staying late to help newer patients and owning her behavior without deflecting. He said those were not performer moves. I thanked him and hung up and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Cautious hope. In a very small dose. Elena asked what he said, and I told her my sister might actually be trying this time. We agreed to stay hopeful and keep every single boundary exactly where it was. Mom called a few days later with a question that surprised me. She asked if I would do individual mother and son sessions with her, separate from the family meetings. I agreed to try. Our first session was painfully awkward. The two of us on opposite ends of Marisol's couch, like strangers at a bus stop. Marisol asked Mom to share some good memories of my childhood. Mom started talking about teaching me to read when I was 4. How I dragged the same dinosaur book to her every night until I could recite it. She remembered my elementary school science fair project and how seriously I took my volcano like it was a dissertation. She told me about a little league game where I struck out 3 times and still ran the dugout fence cheering for everyone else. And how the coach told her afterward that I was the kind of kid who made teams work. I had completely forgotten that game. Hearing her describe it brought the whole afternoon back. The dust and the orange slices and all of it. She talked about my high school graduation, watching me give the salutatorian speech, and how her chest nearly burst. So I asked her the only question that mattered: why did you stop showing up? Her face crumpled. She said the neglect grew in exact proportion to Vanessa's problems. Every crisis pulled her in deeper until managing Vanessa wasn't something she did, it was who she was. She said she lost herself trying to save her daughter and forgot she had a son who needed saving from the side effects. She said she never figured out how to be Vanessa's crisis manager and my mother at the same time, so she quietly stopped being my mother. The honesty hurt like a burn, and it also helped like one being cleaned. I told her I needed her to be my mother now, even at 26, even though the job description had changed. She said she wanted that more than anything, and that she was starting from scratch, learning who I actually was as a grown man. Marisol gave us homework. Time together with a hard rule: no talking about Vanessa. Mom and I planned a Saturday at the farmer's market, just the two of us. Leaving that session, something between us shifted, like a door that had been painted shut, finally giving an inch. The farmer's market Saturday actually happened, and it was actually good. She asked about my work and listened, really listened, while I told her about a brutal client I was managing. She didn't mention Vanessa once through the entire lunch afterward. Back at my car, she hugged me and thanked me for giving her another chance. And I realized it was the first hug in years that didn't feel like an obligation being discharged. Elena noticed it the second I walked in the door. She said I look lighter. I told her I was starting to believe my parents might actually change. And saying it out loud didn't even feel reckless. The next week, Dad called and asked if he could come by the house. When he showed up, he was carrying boxes: Vanessa's designer handbags, her jewelry, her gaming laptop, and her tablet. He explained that he and Vanessa had agreed through her counselor to sell everything of value she owned. He'd spent 2 weeks listing it all online, and it brought in $3,500. He wanted to hand it to me as a down payment on what she owed. I tried to refuse. It felt wrong taking money out of my parents' hands. Dad insisted. He said the money wasn't from him. It was Vanessa's property, sold at Vanessa's request as her first act of taking responsibility. The check said $3,500 exactly, and looking at it made me cry because it was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the weight I'd been carrying with anything other than words. Dad sat with me while I lost it at my own kitchen table, and he apologized again for not seeing it sooner and promised this was only the beginning of making it right. $3,500 was barely 7% of what she owed me. It also meant more than any number on it because it was proof the apology had hands and feet. I deposited it the next day and felt something I'd buried start to breathe again. Theo called a few weeks later. Vanessa was cleared for family visits, and he believed seeing us would strengthen her recovery. I didn't want to go. I was terrified of watching my sister put on the performance of her life for an audience of counselors. Grandma talked me into it. She said you can't know if the change is real from your couch. We drove out together Saturday morning, Mom crying quietly in the passenger seat the whole 2 hours. The building looked like an ordinary office park from outside, but inside it had that institutional smell that lives in hospitals. Vanessa was waiting in a small visiting room with Theo, and I almost didn't recognize her. She'd put on healthy weight. Her eyes were clear in a way I literally could not remember ever seeing. She stood when we walked in and apologized before anyone sat down. No hedging, no excuses sewn into the seams. She looked directly at me and listed it. She was sorry for wishing me dead, for draining my accounts, for threatening to hurt herself as leverage, for making me responsible for her happiness, and then punishing me for it. Mom started crying, but Vanessa kept her eyes on me and said she understood if I never forgave her. She just wanted me to know she was trying to become someone worth being my sister. It landed differently this time because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for anything. We sat down, and she talked about her work with Theo. She'd been digging into her resentment and entitlement, and she'd realized her gambling was never really about winning money. It was about punishing herself for feeling worthless, and every loss confirmed the verdict she'd already passed on herself. Theo nodded along and added detail about her progress in group. Then, Vanessa pulled out a notebook and said she wanted to show us something, and my hands started shaking before she even opened it. It was her recovery workbook. The program made every patient document each time they had manipulated someone and what it cost the other person. She opened it and turned page after page, and my name was on almost every single one. Detailed entries on the 3:00 calls, the suicide threats, the lies engineered to open my wallet. The guilt trips calibrated to make me feel responsible for keeping her alive. She'd written down dates, amounts, the exact words she'd used on me each time. Reading my sister's own handwriting, describing what she'd done to me broke something open, and I started crying, and she cried too, apologizing over and over while the pages turned. Seeing it laid out like a ledger made me understand just how calculated it had all been. There were entries about lying to mom and dad, about taking cash from grandma's purse, about borrowing from friends she never intended to repay. Each entry ended with a section where she analyzed why she did it and exactly who it hurt. And the honesty in those paragraphs felt real in a way her spoken words never had. Mom read a few entries and kept whispering that she had no idea. Grandma just sat there with tears running down to the powder on her face. Vanessa said the workbook was the hardest part of the entire program because once your own handwriting convicts you, there's nowhere left to hide. Theo joined the session after the workbook and explained more about her addiction. The gambling chased the high of risk, yes, but mostly it ran on self-punishment. She believed she was worthless, and every loss agreed with her. He said she was building healthier tools now, ways to sit with inadequacy without burning money or people. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic with the permanent footnote that addiction is lifelong and relapse always possible. I asked Theo straight out, in front of her, if he thought she was performing for us. He said the risk never goes to zero, but he repeated what he'd told me on the phone. She'd been helping newer patients without being asked and taking ownership without deflecting. And in his experience, fakers don't volunteer for accountability. On the drive home, Mom admitted she was terrified Vanessa would relapse and would wake up right back at the beginning. I told her that was always possible and that we couldn't control Vanessa's choices. We could only control whether we ever again paid the price for them. The following week, Marisol ran a session on supporting recovery without sliding back into enabling. She had Mom role-play scenarios where Vanessa asked for money or spun an excuse, and Mom practiced saying no out loud. The first few attempts, the word barely made it out of her mouth. By the end of the hour, she could say it like she meant it. Dad attended too and said he was already sketching out a budgeting plan to walk Vanessa through once she had steady paychecks. Marisol warned us that the transition from inpatient back to ordinary life was the single most dangerous window for relapse, and the boundaries needed to be in place before discharge, not after. We agreed on the big one together. Vanessa would not be moving back into her childhood bedroom. She would need her own living situation. Mom hated it, and Mom did not argue. 2 months after intake, Vanessa completed the full 60 days without a single incident. Dio called to say she'd done the work and was ready for discharge, and that he'd already arranged a bed for her in a sober living house. Structure, curfews, random testing, mandatory meetings, everyone agreed it was healthier than the bedroom she grew up in. She kept the warehouse job. She went to meetings every single day. Dad helped her build a budget with her own numbers in it for the first time in her life. I didn't see her for the first few weeks after discharge because I needed room to process, but Dad kept me updated. Then 2 months after the birthday party, Vanessa asked if she could see me at a family dinner Mom was hosting. I said yes because I wanted to see with my own eyes whether the change survived outside the building. She showed up on time, looking wrung out from 40-hour weeks on her feet, leaner from the physical work. Halfway through dinner, she pulled an envelope from her jacket and slid it across the table to me. Inside was a check for $550, with a note that said first payment of $96. Her hands shook when she handed it over. She said she knew $550 was almost nothing against $52,000, but she wanted to start. I looked at the check. It was drawn on her own account, an account she opened herself, funded with money she earned herself. And the look on her face was something I had never once seen there before. Pride that didn't need an audience. She explained she'd been setting aside a slice of every paycheck, and this was the first payment of many. The check felt heavy in my hand because it wasn't paper. It was the first promise my sister had ever kept. Mom cried. Dad clapped her on the shoulder. Even Grandma looked satisfied, which for Grandma is practically a standing ovation. I thanked her and told her I appreciated it, and she nodded and said there'd be one every month. She left early because she had a morning shift, and after the door closed, Elena said quietly that the change in her was visible from across a room. Elena and I settled on a small wedding. 30 guests, close people only, and I made the hard call. Vanessa was not invited. program or no program, payments or no payments. I needed one day that wasn't about monitoring my sister. Mom struggled with it and called a few times asking if I'd reconsider, but she never once deployed a guilt trip, which told me exactly how far she'd come in therapy. Marisol helped her land on it for good. My boundary was protection, not punishment. Mom accepted it. 2 weeks before the wedding, a card arrived from Vanessa. Inside, she'd written that she understood completely why she wasn't invited, and she hoped our day was beautiful. No barbs, no guilt. Just a congratulations that asked for nothing. Our wedding day came, and it was perfect in its smallness. Mom helped Elena's mother with the flowers and never said Vanessa's name once. Dad stood beside me before the ceremony, and when he hugged me, he didn't let go for a long time. At the reception, Dad stood up to give a toast, and the room went quiet. He talked about family and second chances. Then he said in front of everyone we loved that he had failed me as a father for most of my life, and he was grateful beyond words that I was letting him try again. He said he was proud of the man I'd become despite him, not because of him. And he intended to spend whatever years he had left being the father I should have had all along. People came up to me afterwards saying they'd never heard a father say anything like that out loud. I saw more than a few of them crying during it. The wedding felt like a beginning for the whole family, not just for Elena and me. 3 months after the birthday party, Marisol had us working on something she called Rebuilding Positive Interaction Patterns. The assignment was simple and brutal. Practice celebrating my wins the way this family had always celebrated Vanessa's. Mom sat across from me looking like she'd been asked to speak a foreign language. Marisol prompted her to congratulate me on my promotion to senior manager. Mom's hands twisted in her lap. She cleared her throat twice. Then she told me she was proud of me, that I'd earned it through years of work, and she was sorry she'd missed all the promotions before it. Stiff at first. But she never once steered the sentence toward Vanessa. Dad jumped in and admitted he'd been bragging about me to his golf group for weeks. Marisol smiled and said this was progress, even if it felt like learning to walk in shoes 2 sizes too small. We spent the rest of the hour practicing ordinary family conversation, the kind where I existed and Vanessa wasn't the sun. Everything orbited. 2 weeks later, my phone rang while I was making dinner, and Vanessa's name came up on the screen. My shoulders still tensed out of pure habit. I picked up on the 4th ring. She was practically vibrating. She'd been promoted to shift lead at the warehouse. She talked for 20 straight minutes about her new responsibilities, the raise, the new hires she was training, the loading schedules she'd reorganized. Somewhere around minute 15, I realized she hadn't asked me for a single thing. She wasn't steering. She wasn't steering ass. She wasn't setting anything up. She was just sharing good news with her brother, the way normal siblings apparently do. Something moved in my chest that I eventually identified as actual happiness for her. We hung up, and I stood there in the kitchen holding my phone, thinking, so? This is what it's supposed to feel like. Grandma invited Vanessa to Sunday dinner the following week. I heard the story afterward from Mom, who was there. Grandma told Vanessa she was considering writing her back into the will if she held her progress for 6 more months. And Vanessa said something that stopped the whole table. She thanked Grandma and then said she wasn't doing any of this for inheritance money anymore. She said she was doing it because she wanted to become someone this family could actually be proud of. Mom cried retelling it on the phone. She said Vanessa's face looked different when she said it, like the words were coming from somewhere real instead of from the part of her that calculated. My birthday came in early October, and I woke up braced for the usual nothing. Elena kissed me and handed me a card before she left for work, and I sat drinking my coffee, fully prepared for the day to pass, unmarked like the last 6 had. At 9 a.m, my doorbell rang. Mom stood on my porch holding a bakery box and looking nervous as a teenager. She said she'd organized a small party, just family, and asked if I could come over at noon. I drove over feeling strained about the entire concept. When I walked in, Dad and Grandma were standing under streamers next to a cake with my name spelled correctly on it, which sounds like a low bar until you've spent years below it. Mom handed me a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a photo album she'd built herself. Pictures of me as a kid, every page covered in her handwriting. She'd written apologies straight onto the pages. Sorry for missing the Little League Championship. Sorry for forgetting your 14th birthday. Sorry for not being in the audience at your graduation. We sat on her couch turning pages, and both of us ended up crying. She kept saying sorry and squeezing my hand. Dad stood in the doorway watching us with wet eyes and didn't even pretend otherwise. 4 months after the birthday party disaster, Vanessa texted asking if I'd meet her for coffee. Just the two of us. My stomach dropped when I read it. Elena found me staring at the phone and squeezed my shoulder and said, "Only go if you're ready." I agreed to meet her that Saturday at a coffee shop near my office. She was already there when I arrived. Corner table, 2 cups waiting. She'd ordered my usual without asking, which meant that at some point in 23 years, my sister had actually noticed something about me. She looked thinner and tired, but her eyes were clear. She thanked me for coming and said she'd been working with her counselor on making real amends. She said she wanted to talk about the harm she'd caused without expecting forgiveness and without expecting me to make her feel better about it. Then she pulled a folder out of her bag and spread papers across the table. She had built a complete payment plan for the full 5200 set to 10 years instead of the 8 in Victor's agreement, with extra payments mapped against every bonus and overtime opportunity at the warehouse. A spreadsheet with every date and every amount. She said she knew money couldn't repair the damage. She just wanted to carry the full financial weight herself. Every dollar of it. I read through the pages twice. The detail floored me. Interest contingencies if she lost the job, a buffer fund. This was not the sister who had spent her whole life waiting for someone else to do the math. I set the papers down and looked at her across that sticky coffee shop table. I told her I was still her and that trust would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. And then I told her I was proud of her progress, and I meant every word of it. She nodded. No defense, no excuses. She said she'd keep doing the work whether I ever fully forgave her or not. That sentence hit harder than anything else because the old Vanessa would have wept or raged or bargained. This one just accepted the bill. We finished our coffee and she walked me to my car. She hugged me for about 2 seconds, and for the first time in my adult life, my sister's arms around me didn't feel like a setup. Elena and I hosted Thanksgiving at our house in late November, and I invited Vanessa for the first time since the party. She arrived on time carrying a covered dish, wearing clean clothes that actually fit. She handed it to me at the door and thanked us for including her. It was a sweet potato casserole she'd made herself from a recipe she found online, and it was honestly pretty good. Dinner was a little stiff at first, everyone being carefully polite, but it was peaceful in a way our family tables had never once been. Vanessa sat next to Dad, and they talked about work for an hour. I caught her grinning while she described some logistics problems she'd untangled at the warehouse, and Dad leaned in asking follow-up questions like it was the most interesting thing he'd heard all year. Mom passed dishes and never hovered over Vanessa once. We ate pie and watched football, and nobody screamed and nobody cried. 6 months after the birthday party, Marisol scheduled a full progress evaluation with everyone in her office. She went back through her notes from our first session and said the change was remarkable for the time frame. She named specifics: Mom holding boundaries with Vanessa, Dad building an individual relationship with me, Vanessa making payments deep without a single miss. She said setbacks would come because they always do, and recommended monthly maintenance sessions so the old patterns couldn't grow back in the dark. Everyone said yes instantly because nobody in that room wanted to go back to who we were. Vanessa said the monthly sessions kept her accountable. Mom said she needed the structure to keep learning. Dad just nodded and said he'd be there, which from Dad is a signed contract. The next week, Vanessa hit 6 months of sobriety and steady employment, and the whole family showed up at her recovery meeting to watch her take her 6-month chip. The room was full of people in recovery and the families who came with them. When they called her name, she walked to the front and accepted the chip from her sponsor, and then she gave a short speech that took me apart. She talked about hitting rock bottom at her own birthday party, in front of everyone she knew, and how that worst moment of her life turned out to be the one that saved it. She talked about learning to take responsibility and about building relationships that weren't transactions, and then she thanked me by name in front of the whole room. She said her brother finally refusing to bail her out was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, even though at the time it felt like the cruelest. People applauded, and she came back to her seat, and Mom grabbed her hand and Dad put an arm around her shoulders, and Grandma dapped her eyes with a tissue and pretended it was allergies. I sat there watching my family hold my sister up and felt something I eventually recognized as hope. Mom called the following week asking if I wanted to go to the farmer's market again. I almost said no out of reflex, and then I heard something in her voice and said yes. We walked the stalls, and she held up a jar of honey and asked which one I'd actually use. And when I gave my honest opinion, she put the other one back. Small thing, new thing. 20 minutes in, she stopped in the middle of the aisle with tears standing in her eyes and said she'd realized she didn't know my taste in anything. Coffee, music, books, nothing. So, she asked, and I answered, and she asked follow-up questions about my projects at work and my coworkers, and remembered the names I'd mentioned a month earlier. She never said Vanessa's name once. We sat down with coffee at the end, and she told me she was finally learning who her son actually was, and that she was amazed by the man I'd become in spite of her. I didn't have words for that, so I just nodded, and she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. 2 days later, Dad texted asking if I'd meet him for breakfast Wednesday morning. I found him already in a booth at the diner near my office, with a notebook open in front of him. He stood up and hugged me, which still felt brand new every time. We ordered, and he tapped the notebook. He said he wanted to start a standing tradition. Breakfast every week, just the two of us. He'd been writing down questions about my life because he'd missed all of it and intended to catch up properly. He asked how I got into marketing, and I walked him through the internships and the promotions, and he took actual notes so he'd remember the details. He asked about my marriage, what Elena and I do together. I told him about our weekend hikes and our disaster cooking experiments, and he wrote that down too, like he was studying for the most important test of his life. Then he asked about the future, whether we wanted kids. I admitted I'd been scared of the idea for years because I didn't want to repeat what our family had been. Dad put his pen down and looked at me and said he understood that fear better than I knew. Then he promised that if I ever did have children, he would be a better grandfather than he ever was a father, and he would spend the rest of his life proving it. Vanessa called the next evening, and I braced out of habit and then heard her voice and let go of the brace. She'd been accepted to community college to finish her degree. I asked how she was paying for it, and she said savings from the warehouse, plus financial aid she'd applied for herself. She said she was doing it the right way this time, with nobody's checkbook but her own. I told her I was genuinely proud of her and meant it down to the core. She thanked me and said she had to run. Registration closed at 8 p.m. The whole call took 3 minutes, and she never asked me for a thing. Grandma invited Vanessa to lunch that Saturday, and Vanessa showed up nervous about what was coming. Grandma sat her down at the kitchen table and pulled out the revised will. She was writing Vanessa back in, but structuring her inheritance as a trust that paid out over 20 years. Vanessa read the pages and nodded slowly. Grandma explained it would protect her from herself so that no version of her in any year could burn it all at once. And then Vanessa surprised everyone again. She thanked her for the structure. She said she knew better than anyone that she couldn't be trusted with a lump sum, and she was grateful Grandma was protecting her from the person she used to be. Grandma patted her hand and said she was proud of her self-awareness, then poured the tea, and they spent the whole afternoon talking about school and recovery. 8 months after the birthday party, I noticed something at my desk at work. My shoulders weren't up around my ears. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no emergencies, and I realized I hadn't felt that low hum of dread in weeks. All the mental bandwidth I used to burn on Vanessa's crises had quietly come back to me, and I'd been spending it on my own life without noticing. Elena saw it the second I walked in that evening. She said I seemed lighter, present. We cooked dinner together, and she brought up kids again, and this time I didn't flinch. We talked timelines. We talked names. We talked about the family we wanted to build, and for the first time, the conversation felt like planning instead of risk assessment. Christmas came, and we all gathered at my parents' house. I walked in with my arms full of gifts, and the first thing I noticed was the tree. There were presents under it with my name on them, a lot of them. For the first time in my memory, the pile was balanced. Mom handed me a carefully wrapped box, and inside was a leather journal she'd picked out specifically for me because I had mentioned once in passing 2 months earlier that I wanted to start journaling. She'd remembered. Dad gave me a framed photo of the two of us at my college graduation that he dug out of a box in storage from the one milestone he did attend. Vanessa came to me last holding a wrapped frame. Inside was a photo of the two of us as kids, maybe 6 and 9, building a sandcastle at the beach. Both of us grinning with no front teeth between us. On the back, she'd written that she wanted to be worthy of that bond again. I hugged my sister and felt tears on my face and didn't fight them. We ate dinner, and nobody raised their voice, and nobody cried except in the good way. The conversation moved around the table evenly, everyone getting their turn. Mom asked about my big work project and remembered every detail from the last time we talked about it. Dad told a story from his own childhood and folded me into it. Vanessa talked about her classes with actual light in her eyes. In early January, Vanessa stopped by my house with an envelope, her 8th payment. It brought the total she'd repaid to $4,400. 8 months, 8 checks, never one day late. She told me she'd opened a savings account for the first time in her life and showed me the balance on her phone with this look on her face like she'd built the bank herself. She said she was learning that things you earn feel different from things you're given, and that paying her own bills was the first thing in years that made her feel like a person. I made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table for an hour while she talked about finishing her degree and maybe making operations manager someday. Goals, timelines, plans with her own name on them. A completely different human being wearing my sister's face. We rang in the new year together as a family at my parents' house on December 31st. I stood in their living room holding a glass of champagne and just looked at everyone for a minute. Mom was laughing at something Dad said while she refilled the snack bowls. Vanessa was helping Grandma into her chair, making sure she could see the TV. Elena stood beside me with her arm around my waist. I watched the countdown clock and realized the worst sentence my sister ever spoke became the thing that finally made this family healthy. We weren't perfect. We were honest, and that turned out to matter more. The countdown hit 0 and the room cheered. I kissed Elena and hugged my parents and my grandmother. So, that's my story. It's been a crazy, painful, and ultimately a hopeful journey. Have you ever faced something like this where you had to break things down to rebuild them? What would you have done in my place? I really want to know what you think, so please share your thoughts in the comments below.